In today's video, we're going to be taking a little walk down memory lane as we review the top 10 deadline deals over the past 10 seasons in the NHL. And that's coming up next. Hey everyone, and welcome back to another video here at Top Shelf Hockey. If you're new to the channel, thanks for stopping by. We review and discuss all 31 NHL teams. So if you're a huge hockey fan, consider subscribing and clicking the bell so you don't miss anything. Obviously with this year's NHL trade deadline coming fast, there's been all kinds of rumors floating around as usual. We've seen a few trades go down, and it seems like either between trades and trade rumors, that's something we discuss quite heavily here on this channel. So I thought it would be fun to take a look back here at some recent history and make a list of the top 10 deadline deals that went down at the trade deadline over the past 10 seasons. Now obviously sometimes when teams are trying to go all in and make a run for the Stanley Cup, sometimes it works out and sometimes it doesn't. So some of these deals, the reason they made the list is because of the high profile players involved, and we have some good examples where it's worked out great, and we have some really good examples where they really failed miserably and the team got no further ahead, and you could even argue were set back due to what they gave up for these players that they were trying to bring in to get them over the top. So let's take a look here. I'm going to count down from number 10 all the way to number 1. They're not necessarily in order of working out or not working out. They're just how I felt they were most relevant, and the ones near the bottom of the list are more so ones that didn't work out. So you'll kind of see here as we go, but certainly leave some comments down below about each of these deals. I'm sure most of you are going to be familiar with a lot of these trades, and they may be part of the teams that you cheer for. So leave some comments down below about each of these deals and let me know what you think about them now that they're all long since gone, and now that we can really fully analyze how they impacted the outcome of that season and for those teams. So let's jump in. Number 10. We don't have to go back all that far. We're only going back to last season with the Washington Capitals picking up Kevin Shattenkirk from the St. Louis Blues. Now they traded Shattenkirk along with Phoenix Copley in return for Zach Sanford, Brad Malone, and 2 draft picks. Now Shattenkirk didn't do too badly in Washington, but he certainly wasn't a star there by any means. He did put up 14 points in 19 games before the season came to an end, and then he had 6 points out of 13 playoff games. So the playoffs is really where it matters most. That's why he was brought in. He only ended up putting up 6 points, and the Washington Capitals yet again went out in the second round. So the Capitals did not get any further ahead by adding Shattenkirk, even though he kind of played okay, didn't have a great playoff run with them, and at the end of the day, they didn't get any further than they had during the Ovechkin era here in Washington. So really, was that one worth it? You could probably argue now that that deal didn't really work out. Obviously, the prospects, the younger players like Sanford and Malone that were given up, haven't really developed to much of anything in St. Louis. But the draft picks, you never know. There's still draft picks that could have been had by the team that are now long gone. So obviously those picks are going to be years away from determining if they really backfired on the Capitals or not. But either way, you could argue that deal did not work. Moving along here, number 9 on our list, we have Kimmo Timonen going to the Chicago Blackhawks. By the way, Philadelphia Flyers back in February of 2015. He was traded for 2 draft picks. He appeared in 39 games, including regular season and playoffs for Chicago. The Chicago Blackhawks went on to win the Stanley Cup. So obviously that deal did pay off for Chicago. He was added a nice depth piece for their defense, and he worked out nicely. He wasn't a huge contributor, but it still added the extra depth, which is oftentimes what teams need. And he was the first person that Jonathan Toews passed the Stanley Cup to. It wasn't long after that Timonen retired. Obviously, he had been out a lot that season with the Flyers. I believe it was due to blood clots and some other issues he was having health-wise. He got cleared in time to play before the deadline and actually went on a nice little run with Chicago, wins the Stanley Cup, and gets to end his career on a high note. So obviously that deal worked out. The 2 draft picks at this point, the Chicago's not too worried about that since they won the Stanley Cup. So that one, you could say, worked out for the best for Chicago. Moving along to number 8, we have Jagr, the ageless wonder who was traded from the New Jersey Devils over to the Florida Panthers. Now at that point, he was traded for 2 draft picks. During his time in Florida, he played 20 games during the rest of the regular season, and he had 18 points. So he played very well for the Panthers down the stretch. However, the Florida Panthers did not make the playoffs. So really, Now this is another type of deal, though. They ended up re-signing Jagr. As we all know, he did stay in Florida a little bit longer. In the following year, they went on to win their division, and even though they had another early playoff exit, still you could argue that they get to keep Jagr longer term. So that one's not so bad. But at the same time, though, for that particular season, and the fact that they added and didn't make the playoffs, you could argue from that point that it wasn't good and didn't work out. But at least they got to re-sign him and get the benefit of him playing there longer, and they did have a good year the next year. So overall, that one's not so bad. Number 7 on our list goes back to February of 2014. The Buffalo Sabres trade goaltender Ryan Miller, who at that point holds the majority of the franchise goaltending records. He was traded to the St. Louis Blues along with Steve Ott, who I believe was the Sabres captain at the time, for Jaro Halak, Chris Stewart, William Carrier, and 2 draft picks. What happened there? Well, the St. Louis Blues, they made the playoffs and they lost in the first round. That's a pretty big, significant chunk of players going the other way to the Sabres for another playoff upset. Now, what happened after that? Ryan Miller did not stay in St. Louis. He went on to sign a 3-year deal with the Vancouver Canucks later that summer. So really, you can take a look at that deal. And Steve Ott, I think, stayed around for, I think it was one more season, I believe, or something with St. Louis. So really, they gave up a lot in return for very little, and they didn't get any further ahead. So you could argue that deal backfired on the Blues. Number 6. This was a fairly significant trade. Eric Staal was traded from the Carolina Hurricanes to the New York Rangers in February of 2016. He gets a chance to play with his brother Mark in New York. They gave up 2 draft picks and Alexei Sarella, who I believe at this point still hasn't developed into an NHL player. So the draft picks, I'm not sure where the draft picks turned out to be. They could be a ways away considering it's only been a couple of years anyhow. But the Rangers went on to lose in the first round of the playoffs that year, and Eric Staal never really found his groove with New York. He only had 6 points in 20 games, and even though he got to play with his brother, it just didn't seem to be a great fit for Eric Staal. Eric Staal ended up leaving and later signing with the Minnesota Wild, and so you could argue that that deal for the Rangers didn't really pan out. Now we're moving along to March 2015 is where we get our ranked deal number 5. We got Roberto Luongo was finally traded by the Vancouver Canucks down to the Florida Panthers, back where he started. He was traded along with prospect Stephen Anthony for Jacob Markstrom and Sean Matthias. Now, even though there was all kinds of trade speculation around Luongo for a long time, it's kind of weird what Vancouver ended up doing here. They had to hold Luongo and Schneider debate, and what did they do? They ended up trading both of them, and now they're stuck with Jacob Markstrom, who really isn't all that great in my opinion. He's a decent goalie, probably be a better backup, but really, they've done some weird things with goaltending in Vancouver the last number of years. But what happened with the Florida Panthers? They pick up Luongo and they missed the playoffs. So again, if you look back 2014, it's also another case of the Florida Panthers picking up at the deadline and not really benefiting from it. Now, the good news is this was more of a hockey trade. Obviously, Luongo had a long-term contract. We're still involved with that. He still has a number of years left. So obviously, it wasn't a case of a rental player. So at least it's not so bad. And they did get to improve their goaltending. Longer term, Luongo has played pretty well in Florida. They've since added James Reimer. So really, overall, you could argue that this was a good deal for Florida, but the short-term benefits of a deadline deal didn't really come to fruition here in this particular case. But at least there are some positives that came out of it longer term. Number 4, we have to go back to March of 2014. The fairly significant deal between the New York Rangers and the Tampa Bay Lightning. We saw the Tampa Bay Lightning trade Marty St. Louis to the Rangers straight up for Ryan Callaghan. Now this deal, I think, worked out relatively well, short term at least, for both teams. The Rangers ended up making the finals that year. Marty St. Louis ended up getting 15 points in 25 playoff games. He did have a slower start in the regular season for the remainder of that season before the playoffs kicked in, but he did play well when it mattered most. And the Rangers went all the way to the finals, except they lost to the LA Kings, came up a little short, but either way, at least they got a good run. And really, overall, I mean, St. Louis played one more season there. I know there's Rangers fans that watch these videos, so let me know your thoughts on that. I'd be curious to get a Rangers perspective on that trade. But I think for the most part, if you look how Ryan Callaghan has played in Tampa and seen his decline over the last number of years, really, you could probably argue that trade worked out pretty good. Callaghan's first couple years in Tampa weren't too bad, so I think really you could probably argue over the time that they were both still playing that it wasn't too bad a deal, and that it worked out fairly okay for both teams. All right, the number 3 trade on my list happened in February of 2012. The Columbus Blue Jackets trade forward Jeff Carter to the Los Angeles Kings for Jack Johnson. Now, obviously, Johnson's had a decent career with Columbus. He's still there to this day, but as you all know by now, he wants out of Columbus and will likely be one of the main players we talk about at this year's deadline. But back then, let's take a look. Jeff Carter's gone on. He went on to play a lot of games in the playoffs. The LA Kings win the Stanley Cup, and Jeff Carter scores the cup-winning goal. So obviously that move paid off quite well for LA. Obviously, Carter is still there to this day, and they've got not only to win the Stanley Cup that year, but another one after. So obviously, we have multiple Stanley Cups, and Jeff Carter's played a big role on that team ever since. So that arguably has to be one of the better deadline deals to work out in the favor of the team picking up the player at the deadline there that we've ever seen in recent history. So that worked out quite well for LA. Number 2 deal on my list for the top 10 here involves the Pittsburgh Penguins picking up Marian Hossa from the Atlanta Thrashers back in February 2008. This was a fairly significant trade with lots of pieces being moved. Hossa came to Pittsburgh along with forward Pascal Dupuis. Going back the other way was Colby Armstrong, Eric Christensen, prospect Angelo Esposito, and a first-round draft pick in that year's draft of 2008. Well, obviously the Pittsburgh Penguins had a great playoff season. They went all the way to the finals, where they lost against the Detroit Red Wings. So even though this deal worked out fairly well for the Penguins, they got a fantastic playoff run, a lot of great experience, especially for their younger players. It was Crosby's first time to the finals that year. Malkin, Fleury, all those young guys are really benefited from the experience. Unfortunately, they came up a little bit short of a Stanley Cup. Hossa himself played extremely well for them at 26 points over 20 playoff games. So really, you can't fault them there. And considering what they gave up, most of what they gave up never really materialized in Atlanta. So you could argue this deal worked out really well, even though Hossa didn't stick around with Pittsburgh. Now get this, in case you forgot, the next year he signs a 1-year deal with the Detroit Red Wings. We had a rematch in the Stanley Cup final, Red Wings versus Penguins again, except now Hossa's on the other side. And what happens? The Penguins win the Cup, and Hossa's on the losing side yet again. Now after that, don't feel bad for Hossa. He went on to sign a massive 12-year contract with the Chicago Blackhawks, and they won multiple Stanley Cups with him on their roster. So Marian's made out just fine. No need to feel bad for him. But it was kind of a couple of bad years where he just picked the wrong team to sign with, I guess. But even though he played well and the team has benefited from his impact, it just came up short in the Stanley Cup pursuit. Now, the number 1 deal on this list for me, and the reason I have it here, is the price tag was so low, but yet the impact was so high. The Pittsburgh Penguins in 2009 picked up Bill Guerin from the New York Islanders for a conditional draft pick. That's all it was, a conditional draft pick. Bill Guerin was an instrumental top 6 forward, played a fair bit with Sidney Crosby, ended up scoring 15 points in 24 playoff games, and the Penguins go on to win the Stanley Cup. So obviously, based on these deals, you can see sometimes it pays off, sometimes it doesn't. There's certainly a high element of risk involved with a lot of these deals. I gave some great examples where the teams went on to win the Cup, and I also gave some great examples where they either failed to qualify for the playoffs or they went out in the first or second round and didn't really get any further ahead. So I caution all these teams looking to make these big blockbuster deals. Please proceed with caution, tread lightly. You could screw your franchise up for years to come, or you could take it over the top and you could end up winning the Stanley Cup. So you need to be careful with these deals. I'm sure a lot of the people watching these, based on your fan base and what team you cheer for, I'm sure you'd like to see them win the Cup, but I'm sure at the same time, you don't want to see them give away the farm just to fall up short. So leave some comments down below. It's been fun putting together this list, taking a little rundown, deadline deal memory lane. Don't forget as well to follow us on social media. You're going to see our Twitter account right here on the screen. We're also on Facebook and Instagram, and all those accounts are linked down below in the description. Thank you very much for watching, everybody. We will catch you next time.